In this video, I'd like to discuss 10 classic jazz guitar players that are well worth checking out if you're new to the genre and you're wanting to know the guys that you want to listen to get an idea of what jazz guitar sounds like. Now, if you're new around here, then I'd highly recommend that you check out my free beginner jazz guitar guide that'll help you get started with learning jazz, and there's a free link to that you can find in the description below this video. So to narrow this list down a little bit, what I've done is effectively looked at all those jazz guitar players that were born within the same decade, give or take. There's a few exceptions for some of the very early players, but most of the players were born in the 1920s, 1930s, and these are the guys that really set the standard for what jazz guitar is, and have influenced all the players that are basically around today. So let's get on with the list and see what you think. I'm going to begin this list, as many of you would suspect, by talking about the big three jazz guitar players. So these three players really, I guess, are the most influential out of all 10. And if you have any idea about jazz guitar, then you probably know the three players that I'm going to talk about. So let's get on with the first player, and this is in no particular order, by the way. The first jazz guitar player that I'd like to discuss was one of the very first electric jazz guitarists who basically changed what jazz guitar is and what jazz guitar could be. This particular player was way ahead of his time, both in terms of his playing and his compositions. Some of his compositions even had an early influence on things like rockabilly and rock and roll. This particular player not only influenced jazz players such as Wes Montgomery and Jim Hall, but also blues players like T-Bone Walker, Chuck Berry, and even B.B. King. This guy was an early influence on bebop in the early 1940s, but unfortunately passed away at the young age of 25. Of course, the jazz guitar player that I'm talking about is Charlie Christian. Unfortunately, there's no video footage of Christian available, but all his recordings have been reissued on all the various streaming services and CDs. If you haven't heard Charlie Christian play before, then stop this video and check him out. The next player was an early developer and practitioner of an entire sub-genre of jazz. Like Christian, he not only influenced jazz players, but also rock players such as Tony Iommi, Jeff Beck, and even Jerry Garcia. The next jazz guitar player is the last of the big three. I've already mentioned his name, and there's a good chance that you know exactly who I'm talking about. This player also passed away at a relatively young age, unfortunately, and there are basically two types of jazz guitar. The type of jazz guitar that was played before this player came along, and then the type of jazz guitar that came about after this player. So he had a massive influence on how people approach the electric jazz guitar. This particular player came along a bit later than the first two that I previously mentioned, and was a huge influence on people like George Benson and Pat Martino. Like the first two players that I mentioned, this player played guitar with a technique that was completely personal and unique to him. No one had ever played guitar exactly like him before. He just used his thumb, and he actually rarely used his pinky, so in terms of conventional guitar technique, he might have been a guitar teacher's nightmare, but he obviously became one of the most iconic, if not the most iconic, jazz guitar player who ever lived, and the guy that I'm talking about is Wes Montgomery. The next player that I'm talking about I consider to be the father of modern jazz guitar. At least one of them. There's a few others who played with a similar style, but he was the guy that really made it popular through his pioneering of what a guitar trio could be and how he approached improvisation. This particular player basically approached improvisation like a composer. He liked to play off motif and motif development, and really thought of improvisation as composition as much as improvising. This guitarist's style and sound developed throughout his entire career, so if you actually get some of his recordings from early on in his career and then compare that to some of his later recordings, you'd almost struggle to hear that it was the same guitar player in some ways, especially if you listen to his first two albums. The guitar player that I'm talking about is the late great Jim Hall. The next guitar player that I'd like to share with you was one of the very first guitar players to develop and popularise playing as a guitar trio, meaning that there would just be a jazz guitar player, a drummer and a bass player. Besides that, he was one of the first ones to really popularise chord melody, how to both play it in a band situation and as a solo guitar entity. Now, of course, before this player, players in the 1920s and 30s were playing solo plectrum guitar, people like Eddie Lang, but this guy really kind of made it more popular in a straight ahead jazz guitar style, I would say at least. So the jazz guitar player that I'm talking about, in case you haven't guessed, is Barney Kessel. The next jazz guitar player that I'd like to share with you seldom, if ever, played chords or chord melody. What this player was known for was burning single line solos and having possibly the most unique and distinctive jazz guitar tone. He recorded extensively for Blue Note Records in the early 60s, so you can get a lot of his records to listen to, as well as records under his own name. The jazz guitar player that I'm of course telling you about is Grant Green. The next player is probably most known for his work as a solo jazz guitar player, but he is also an amazing bebop player. He basically set the standard for what solo jazz guitar could be. Like with Barney Kessel, there was solo pieces played before him, but he really took this to a new level and set the standard for solo jazz guitar fingerstyle and even hybrid picking and playing with a pick. Besides recording under his own name, this particular player had some great records with the likes of Ella Fitzgerald and Oscar Peterson. Unlike some of the other players on this list that were mainly blues based, such as Grant Green, Barney Kessel, players like that, this particular player didn't really play too much like a guitar player. He was in some ways more in keeping with some of the 1950s bop players. So the jazz guitar player that I'm talking about, as you've probably guessed by this point, is Joe Pass. The next jazz guitar player that I'd like to tell you about is the only jazz guitar player who recorded with John Coltrane. This particular player was influenced by some of the early players that I've already mentioned, like Charlie Christian, Django, as well as blues guitar players like T-Bone Walker and Muddy Waters. His recordings made jazz accessible to blues guitar players and released blues and jazz records really under his own name and with players such as Jimmy Smith. This particular jazz guitar player has thankfully had a long career and is still with us at the time of recording this video. The jazz guitar player that I'm talking about is Kenny Burrell. The next player on this list was a big influence on players like George Benson, Pat Martino and Hank Garland. This player was a music educator, guitar teacher, session musician and one of the early pioneers of plectrum style guitar, playing chord melody, that kind of style that was also associated with Barney Kessel. He was one of the guys in the 1950s that really popularised playing chord melody pieces within a band context. I forgot to mention that this particular guitar player also influenced the Venturers, who later covered one of his most famous songs. The jazz guitar player that I'm talking about is Johnny Smith. In 10th position on this list, I actually had to put two bebop jazz guitar players because I couldn't decide which of the two had the most influence. They were both equally influential, I would say. So the jazz guitar players that I'm talking about are Jimmy Rainey and Tal Fowler. These guys were some of the most known players who adapted some of the bebop saxophone language on the guitar. Of course, there were others who were less known, but these are the two guys that you will often hear as being cited as influence on all the players that came after them, such as Hank Garland, Wes Montgomery, George Benson, and even Rene Thomas. Both Tal Fowler and Jimmy Rainey had an extensive discography under their own name, as well as with different sidemen. Besides Jimmy Rainey and Tal Fowler, I'd highly recommend checking out some of the lesser known bebop players, because although Tal and Jimmy Rainey had a massive impact on all the players that came after them, some of the other lesser known players actually took what they did and perfected the bebop idiom on the guitar, in my opinion. I've done standalone videos on some of these players in the past, but just to give you a few names of the standalone bebop jazz guitar players that are also worth checking out: Rene Thomas, Dick Garcia, Ronnie Singer and Lou Mecca. Okay, so that concludes my initial list of 10 classic jazz guitar players. I'd just like to give a few worthy mentions to a couple of players that came later. I've already mentioned their names several times on this list, but just to try and narrow it down to 10, I had to kind of leave a few out, and this, like I said, is in no order of preference. I think that probably every name that I've mentioned in this video is worth checking out, but a few players that came later who also had a massive influence and impact on jazz guitar were Pat Martino, George Benson and Hank Garland. Some of the other players from the 1950s that I didn't mention were guys like Howard Roberts, Chuck Wayne, Sal Salvador. Once again, great players, and if it was a longer list, they would definitely be included. Of course, I didn't even mention some of the very early players like George Barnes, Eddie Lang, Les Paul, etc. Of course, I didn't even mention the modern jazz guitar players like Pat Metheny or Alan Holdsworth. I just wanted to give you the 10 core classic jazz guitar players, and obviously a few others that you could get started with if you haven't heard of them before. So, what did you think of this list? Please share your thoughts in the comment section below. If you want me to do a longer list or a more specific list, I can do that, let me know. And if you enjoyed the content from this channel, please don't forget to subscribe.